actual harvest happened. And when the harvest happened, and since he knew the harvest would be very good, and a lot of people thought, that like most years, there will be some, natural intervention will happen. So he pretty much owned all those, olive presses, and he was able to rent them out at a much higher price, right? It's very, very similar to the kind of things that, you'll see companies doing these days, right? So in some sense, I think this is like, a first recorded, I guess, instance of, data sciences, data mining, analytics, whatever you want to call it, right? But you kind of have to go back and look at history, right? And what did he do? Essentially, he went and collected a lot of data. He built some sort of model, and then he used that data to go predict something, and he was very confident about his prediction. He used that, go get some economic gain. And that's, I guess, almost everybody here is trying to go do that right now, right? So I think very interesting if you kind of go back in history and kind of look at that and how the dots connect, right? It's not something what we are doing right now is new and nobody else has done that in the past, right? This is something that we have been doing, for a while right now, right? So he essentially proved that not gods controlling the crop, but men could also predict, right? And get, financial benefit out of it. So, it was then, but now analytics has essentially become the core of, running business, right? As I look through my journey, right, across multiple big organizations, hundreds of billions of revenue, and you start to think through, the impact of, analytics at decision making, right? And if you kind of go back into history a little bit, I think, in my history, last 15, 20 years, you'll see in US a lot of, maths that's happening in the actuarial science area, right? Then I think we started to see influence happening in the marketing area because, what they call the gut-driven decision making going to what we call the data-driven decision making. But now I think if you look across almost every aspect of any given business, you can use strong analytics to go do that. But what I think is fundamentally changing when I kind of, look through that is the whole concept of data and where does it reside. So I came from those very big organizations like Walmart where lot of effort happens in terms of getting all data inside the enterprise, right? You're building data warehouses, you're collecting all your data, and you have all your orders, shipment, revenue, supply chain data there, your marketing data there, right? But what I realize as I go through my journey, especially in the last 5, 6 years, the data inside the enterprise obviously is growing, but what's also happening, the data outside the enterprise is also coming in. And a lot of that you cannot control, right? Or it's beyond your control, right? All the data that you're getting from social media, right? All the data that, you're getting in the media, right? So in some sense, the big competitive advantage about the data in the enterprise, which still is true, but is now being supplemented also by the data outside the enterprise. And the folks, and that's where the rest of my talk will be, that, the companies and the folks who can actually go use that. So data will start to become a commodity, but, your competitive edge is dependent on what can you do with that class of data, right? So by the way, anybody can figure out what this is. What does that map represent? I think I know it's kind of, right before the coffee. Are any guesses? Huh? Okay. Maturity of enterprise business data. Okay. So this is very interesting. You guys remember, right? So our current Democrat presidential candidate Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State in the last Obama administration, right? And I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the big controversy she had, right? So she was using her personal email to do a bunch of official transactions, right? And she was subpoenaed, a bunch of things which happened. So what essentially happened, a class of about 10,000 of that email in that ecosystem became public records, right? So, and that's what I'm trying to go connect the dots here, right? So essentially a Secretary of State, and in that ecosystem, the bunch of emails, and about 10,000 of those, they became public record. Kaggle is a company which kind of does these things. So what they did was they got access to it, they cleaned it up, they plotted that out, right? And essentially, what this map represents in some sense is a US foreign policy in that 4-year time period. Very interesting, right? And this is, if you look through that, the kind of, the color coding thing, right? So in that time period, if you look at, kind of, Northern Africa, Libya and Egypt, a lot of things were happening, if you recall that, right? So a lot of emphasis there on Libya and Egypt, right? On the Western Africa side, Ebola was kind of, big deal around that time, right? So you'll see a lot of Niger and a bunch of those countries on those sides, right? Look at Great Britain has always been a big ally, right? So you'll see that. A lot of presence in the Indian subcontinent, Middle East, you can see the red color, right? And then if, down south there, Australia and New Zealand have been a big allies, right? So I think it's very fascinating in some sense, right? That a country's foreign policy, you can kind of represent that, not in a good way. Obviously, no Secretary of State wants, her emails to be leaked, right? But able to take that class of extremely unstructured data, right? And being able to go represent that, and kind of, I can spend an hour talking about what happened in that foreign policy there, right? But able to kind of go visually represent, essentially what happened in her tenure, as a Secretary of State, right? And I think the key thing here is, this is not the data. Each one of you over here have access to this data. I think that's the point I'm trying to make here, right? So this is not something that, which is very proprietary, right? So I think that's something I talked about, right? That there were nearly 7,000 pages of, that class of data that, that was exposed, right? So this is one class of thing. Again, every single person in this room, or basically any budding data scientist across the world can go access that, right? Another example is that, can number crunching save your eyesight? That's something that, that you can think about, right? And this again, there's a disease called, diabetic retinopathy, right? Essentially, if you have diabetes, if you look at, there are more than, I think, 100 million people, right, who have this class of disease, right? And classically, if you look in the medical research, right, there are a lot of things happening, a lot of research happening, but this is a class of problem which, again, Kaggle, got a lot of data, published that, and make it an open challenge, right? So any one of you, again, can go and, go try to go solve this problem, right? So it's essentially a completely crowdsourced, solution to this class of problem, right? If you, again, take clock back, 15, 20, 30 years ago, could you have ever imagined a class of problem like, trying to figure out, what will happen, a solution to a blindness, caused as a result of diabetes, being solved by somebody who has never been to a medical school? You could not have even imagined that, right? And a lot of the better solutions came from people, who had no medical background. They essentially are looking at patterns and figuring out what the models are and trying to go get that classes of solutions, with them, right? So essentially, a bunch of models developed, and this was another very successful exercise, on the Kaggle, right? Another, I think, thing, I came across, and the point I'm trying to again make, both of these problems we talked about are completely open source in the sense that anybody over here can make an attempt at it. So these companies, have put faith into the wisdom of crowd. They're not, trying to go, the point here is that, if I go back to my old days where, everything has to be completely inside the enterprise, things are opening up right now. So this is another class of problem in the airlines industry in US, right? Where they're trying to go solve, the classic problems, you run across all big airports in the world, right? Trying to go optimize, the arrival times, getting the airplanes to the gate at the right time, right? And how do you, it's a huge problem. Look at Sabre, they spend billions of dollars trying to go solve that, for airlines, right? Again, an open source a problem in the Kaggle ecosystem that has been used, and the solution there, now is trying to go get implemented, right? And I can go on and on and on, with hundreds of examples across multiple industries, right? But what is fascinating here is, again, having run big data sciences team, all these examples I had here and bunch of them were not solved by a team which I went and, and hired, This is all solved by, common people across the world, people who have interest in data science, right? So these are all solutions for crowdsourced, right? And this is a very fundamental shift to where, people like me grew up into traditional ecosystem, right? You go build teams. I'm still going to go do that. But I think this is essentially, I will say, an essence of democratization of data, right? A smart kid in India can make an attempt at this thing and go win that competition and actually give a solution which one of the biggest companies in the world will go and implement that, right? Can you even imagine 8 years ago something like that, even think about that? I mean, could not have thought about that, right? So I think a lot of those barriers around, coming up with, the degree, getting your PhDs from a different schools. I mean, right now, if you have intelligence, you can go make an attempt and go solve these classes of problems, right? So there's essentially a very fundamental, fascinating shift that is happening, as we see that, right? And this is something, as an analytics community that you got to go look at it, right? I'm not saying the data and the skills inside the enterprise are not important. They're actually very, very, very important. But a fundamental shift that's happening that we got to recognize and go act on that, right? And as you start to think through your analytics journey, this is something that's very, very, very important, right? So I think if kind of, rewind the clock a little bit, what is data science? Every single day, I think coming over here, I think several of you must have used, Google Maps to come here, right? It's actually collecting data in real time, telling you, don't take outer ring road, go take a side ring road, right? So essentially, doing that, right? When you go browse on the website, having known, what your previous browsing history was, it will give you a recommendation, right? Look at, search, right? You start typing in Google, start to go figure out, what you're trying to go do, right? You start typing bi-ethnic and you start to go see that, right? You start, looking for certain things, based on what it knows, it will go recommend you certain other things, right? And this is all happening to all of us, day in and day out, right? I remember, use case in my last job at HP where, we were able to kind of, for small and medium businesses across the US, right? There are close to 20 million SMBs in US, right? And what we wanted to do was essentially, and out of that 20 million, about 500,000 of them were the customers, right? And HP being a big company, has multiple products, from printers to PCs to servers, right? And a classical marketing problem is there's absolutely no way you can actually go and market directly, to all 20 million of those SMBs. It's way too expensive, right? So essentially what we did was we were able to look at our current customers, which were 500,000, find out among them, which were the most profitable one, do a segmentation, and using that class of segmentation, we were able to target, and then we found a cluster which was only about 6% of the population and 40% of revenue. So we were able to find out of those 20 billion SMBs or the prospects across the US, which one are closest to this cluster, which we call vanguards. And that essentially resulted into an incremental $148 million of revenue, right? So again, old classical marketing, right? Putting a little bit of, targeted marketing there can have a huge, huge impact, on the outcome of the organization, right? So again, if you look at, how do you do retargeting, how the relevant ads comes in, how do you personalize the content, the targeted discounting and the real-time pricing, these are all direct, indirect impact of the classes of analytics different organizations are doing that you are experiencing day in and day out, right? Something, again, almost every single one of you and no data science talk, I think will finish without talking about sentiment analysis. And the reason I wanted to talk about that, it reminds me when I was at Walmart, in late 90s, we started a project, and at that time, email was not very prevalent. A lot of people will actually write letters to the president of Walmart. And I think it's a very, very organized practice. So, for example, I remember a woman in Florida, right? They had certain shampoos for a certain thing which was not selling well, but she will write a letter to the president of the company saying, hey, you discontinued my shampoo and this is the only thing I was using, right? So they will get multiple letters like that. So we, in this is about 97 time frame, if I remember correctly, right? So we in fact had an internal project that somebody will actually take that letter, read it, and in an Excel kind of, do a bit of a metadata, where it came from, what date it came from, what's talking about, is it a complaint or this is something else. And then we try to go infer something out of it. Now I think you fast forward another 15, 20 years, the whole cottage industry around sentiment analysis has come up, right? I think the sentiments, remain the same. But I think now, if you look through that, there are tons of patents in that area. There are tons of tools in that area. There are hundreds of companies, working in that space, right? So I think the problem is the same. The way we are solving it now, we have a lot more compute. We have a lot more science in the classical industrial area, which we didn't have at that point of time. But these classes of problems already existed at that point of time, right? So in terms of, as we evolve, as we see all the interactions happening, how do we go and create a really democratic, organization? And I like the discussion right before when I walked in here. We're talking about what is a good data science or analytics organization, right? What do we call it a healthy analytics organization? I think personally, what I think of that, is almost a three-legged stool, right? So one component of that is what I call the hardcore data sciences. You've got to know your math, your statistics. You got to know, modeling. You got to know regression and machine learning and things like that, right? The second part of that is that you got to understand, the technology, right? So early in my career, I had hired, PhDs in statistics, from, in US, and some of them will be unbelievably good, but they felt that getting the data from database and writing the queries beneath their dignity, right? So they expect a DBA to go give them the data on a platter, right? All they wanted to do was go build models, right? And that, I think, fundamentally is shifting right now, right? You got to kind of, be very comfortable, I think, finding your own data, because in that ecosystem, you will only ask what you know, and that the DBA or the developer who's getting the data will only give you what you ask for. So you'll never be able to go explore everything, right? And the third most important component, which I think is extremely crucial, is something what I call the business acumen, right? So having the domain expertise, understanding the complete business problem, and being able to connect these three things is something which I will say is a strong analytics organization, right? And I also think overheard a little bit what they're talking about. As now you go look across the world, look in US, look in India, it's very difficult to get somebody who's strong in all three legs, right? But it's very important that you're grounded at least in one of the two legs. But as an organization, you got to have people who, which can bring in a lot of, business acumen, which can bring in a lot of what I call, technical expertise and bring a really deep, expertise into the data sciences part of it. And having all those three legs very strong is something which will make it a very, very strong data science organization, right? And again, I think a lot of you guys probably have seen through what we call the analytical maturity curve, right? And you've probably seen that, at multiple places, right? Essentially, what you want to do is, kind of, go evolve to an ecosystem, where you become more prescriptive in nature, right? A lot of organizations, if you look through right now, are either into what I call the diagnostic or the descriptive analytics. The idea is, can you go optimize the ecosystem, right? And become more prescriptive in nature, right? So I think, I'm gonna kind of quickly, I think, summarize this part of the presentation, saying that, building analytics capability is like building muscles, right? It takes time, right? You got to be persistent. You got to keep, keep moving. As fast as you can. But it does take time. It's not like, you'll hire 15 people and the things will change overnight, right? It's like muscle. It will take some time to go build. I think I'm out of my time, so I'll just quickly summarize a little bit about, the investment Yodlee. I think we are a company about 16 years into it. A lot of you may not have heard about us directly, right? But a Bay Area company, but directly impacting your personal life, right? So essentially, if you rewind the clock a little bit, right? The whole idea about helping manage your finances, right? So each one of us over here probably, I would say, has at a minimum of 10 to 12 financial relationship between your credit card, your debit card, your checking accounts, your mortgages, your car loans, and having an ability to kind of, put all that together, an ability to go guide you, on what to do is something we do, right? I'm not going to get into the detail, right, of what happens. So essentially, a platform where, which can help banks, help, other alternate, FIs, as well as, the areas of, hedge funds, where we can really provide that classes of solutions to the end consumer through the banks or to the hedge funds and the retailers, directly, understanding what's happening, across the ecosystem, right? A big presence in US, but now we have presence in India, right? ICICI, Yes Bank, Aditya Birla are some of the customers here. We have presence in Europe and Australia and everywhere else. I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop right here. Any questions?
So the questions can be taken. Also, in case you want to have a quick cup of coffee, you can step out and get yourself a cup and come back, as we'll start with our next presentation in about 15 minutes. So any questions, please raise your hand and we'll pass on a mic.
Okay. I guess not right now. So let's go get some coffee, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pramod. Thank you for being here at Cypher 2016. And of course, if you think of a question later, you can always contact Pramod offline and he'll be happy to help you with that. So we'll see you back in 15 minutes as we continue with our next sessions.